What's up everybody? My name is Kincade and I bought this KX250 here for $1,000 a few months ago and finally brought it back to life. I made a video series documenting the whole process, and this video ties all of those together into one complete transformation. Links to parts used and the amazing companies that helped out with this project will be in the description below, and feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions. At the end of this video, I will be giving you a sneak peek of the next project bike, which will be going to one lucky winner when it's done. So be sure to click that subscribe button to follow along, and I really hope you enjoyed the revival of this Kawasaki KX250. We got her, baby, we got her. $1,000 KX250 right there. Yep, you heard that right. I messaged the seller of this 2002 Kawasaki KX250 two-stroke just 7 minutes after they listed the bike and snagged it for $1,000. Now, of course, there has to be something wrong with a $1,000 KX250. The seller told me that it was just missing a cylinder head, but of course that is questionable and led me to believe that there's some other funny business going on. I went ahead and ordered a cylinder head on eBay and decided to see if I could get the bike running. I did a visual inspection of the piston after pulling the header pipe, and while it didn't look perfect, the piston and cylinder wall looked okay enough for me to at least try and start the bike. When I tried to install that used cylinder head that I bought on eBay, I realized that the bike was using different cylinder head hangers, which means this bike was running an aftermarket cylinder head previously. So this set me back on my timeline, but I found some OEM hangers on eBay and ordered those, and once those arrived, I was finally able to get the bike back together and see if I could get it running. I began to reassemble the bike. I made sure that it had spark, and the spark was weak, so I was a little bit concerned about that, but I decided to continue putting the bike back together and see what I could find. So I added some coolant and two-stroke fuel, and this is how the first start attempt went. After that first start, I wasn't able to get the bike started again, and a couple times it had some nasty kickback. This was the point when I realized that this was not going to be a quick, easy fix, and I had a lot more work to do. I decided it was time to dig further into this bike and give it a little bit of a revival, so I ordered parts to give her a little bit more love while I tried to diagnose this non-starting issue. I ordered an air filter, fork seals, clutch cable, as well as a top end kit, and I decided to modernize the look of the bike a little bit using DupliColor paint products to paint the triple clamps and the wheels. As I dug farther and farther into this motorcycle, it became obvious pretty quickly that some questionable mechanics have worked on this bike over its 20-year lifetime. The bolts on the bike are all completely mismatched. It seems like less than half of them are actually OEM, and once I pulled the cylinder head, I was not pleased to find that coolant is clearly mixing in the cylinder and crankcase. Removing the cylinder only confirmed this issue, as I could see a nasty mixture that clearly was not just two-stroke fuel. I sat and pondered for a while the best way to proceed, realizing that in order to make this a reliable motorcycle once again, I should probably pull the engine and split the cases. I also realized there is some funny business going on with this ignition coil. I have no idea what this connector between the ignition and the plug cap is. That could certainly be the culprit for the weak spark, so I pulled it apart in attempts to reconnect that cap with the ignition coil, but the wiring on the end of the coil had some damage and would not allow it to accept that spark plug cap, so I found a used ignition on eBay for $39, and hopefully that will help. While I pondered exactly how to proceed with the engine, given that it's likely the cylinder is warped, causing that coolant mixture, I decided to continue pulling the bike apart and give attention to the areas that need it. The struggle I had with this rear axle is kind of a prime example of the condition of this entire bike. This axle clearly hasn't been removed in ages, so after a little bit of heat and some calculated impact, I finally got that crusty old rear axle out and the rear wheel removed. With plans to paint the triple clamps, I preemptively removed that steering stem nut because it is easier to do so while the forks are still installed. Thankfully, removing the front wheel was not a struggle like the rear. That axle had plenty of grease on it and slid out no problem. That said, I did have some difficulty removing the forks. Now, every now and then you do have to pry triple clamps apart a little bit to slide the forks out, but I realized whoever painted this top clamp painted the inside of the clamp as well, which is a major no-go and makes it incredibly difficult to both both install and remove the forks from the clamps. Now, another one I'd never seen is I could not get the top clamp off, and that is because the person had painted the inside of that clamp where it goes on the steering stem as well. Finally was able to get it off with the sledgehammer. I removed the old piston and added it to my ever-growing collection before proceeding to work on removing the bottom end from the frame. After dealing with that rear axle, I had a feeling that this swing arm axle would be pretty well seized in there, and I was certainly right. This thing took an unbelievable amount of force with the sledgehammer. I am fortunate that I did not damage the swing arm axle in the process. I used a little bit of heat and then allowed gravity to help by tipping the bike on its side, and finally got that swing arm axle to pop out and was able to remove the motor from the frame.
I never intended to pull this motor out of this frame.
And at this point I realized that I was just too far along in this disassembly not to complete the teardown and strip the bike all the way to the frame. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't get this linkage bolt to budge, and the linkage bearings were clearly disintegrating. I removed the rear shock and decided to try a different linkage bolt to see if I could get that one out, and I did in fact get that one removed. As I was hammering this bolt out, bearing rollers were falling all over the floor, confirming that these linkage bearings absolutely need to be replaced, and look at how gnarly the bolt is. And as you can see here, the link arm is stuck on the bolt on the swing arm. For all of the bikes I've worked on, this is some of the nastiest linkage I've seen, and it deserves to be rebuilt. At this point, I laid all of the parts out to look at the beautiful mess I've created for myself. I decided to start making progress by tackling the wheels and triple clamps. As you're probably aware, most manufacturers have switched rim color from silver to black over the last decade. It's a much more modern look that people tend to enjoy. So while we're giving this old KX250 a bit of a revival, I figured let's not only replace and rebuild the components that need it, but let's modernize the look a little bit. So after making quick work of tire removal with my Rabiconda tire changer stand, I got that rear sprocket off using the assistance of a MAP gas torch. If you didn't know, those sprocket bolts are often red Loctited, so using heat greatly aids in removal. For this wheel set, I decided that I will be replacing all of the spokes and nipples. For how seized every single bolt has been on this bike, I decided that truthfully I did not want to have to deal with disassembling and reassembling a wheel with these nasty old spokes. And for the 6% of my audience that is a female viewer and in attempts to grow that, here's a zoomed out shot of cutting those old spokes. And with those wheels disassembled, it made sense to do the prep for the triple clamps at the same time. Taking a closer look at these rims, I wanted to get some of those imperfections buffed out, as well as remove the casting lines from the triple clamps before sandblasting and then moving into the painting process. I used some paint remover on that upper clamp that had the nasty, poorly done coat of black paint and spread that evenly, and while I let that set and bubble up the paint, I continued making progress by using Prime MX wheels on the rims and the lower triple clamp. Being a lovely spring day, I decided to do this outside in hopes that the metal shavings would kill all of the dandelions in my yard. I started with a flap wheel and then moved on to the coarse cleaning wheel, which did a really good job at buffing out scratches and pitting. The coarse cleaning wheel also makes very quick work of removing casting lines from the triple clamps. If you would like to order some Prime products for yourself, I will have a link on screen and in the description. When using my link, I earn a small commission at no extra cost to you. By the time I had finished prepping the rims and lower triple clamp for blasting, that paint remover had done its job and the paint started bubbling up, so I hit it with a steel brush before going at it with the power washer to get most of that paint off. As you can see, there was a nasty coat of red beneath the black, so I don't know what color this KX250 was at one point in its life, but we're gonna make sure it's looking good. I sandblasted each component to prepare for paint, and the rims definitely tested the size of my blast cabinet. They just barely fit, but I was able to get it done. So this is what I see while I'm sandblasting parts, and this is what my blast cabinet sees while I'm sandblasting parts. To complete all of the steps of prep for both the wheels and triple clamps in the same day, I shifted my attention to the hubs and removed those old, nasty, worn out wheel bearings before shining the hubs up with, you guessed it, Prime MX cleaning wheels, and the hubs went from looking like this to this. This left just one more step in the prep process before applying color to the rims and triple clamps. I'm proud to have partnered with DupliColor for this project, and I used their prep spray to do a final degreasing before applying color to be sure that the parts are totally clean and will have maximum adhesion. The other DupliColor products I'm using for this project are self-etching primer, which is step 1 for both the triple clamps and the rims before applying the color coats. And then for the rims, I'm using DupliColor wheel paint, and for the triple clamps, I'm using DupliColor acrylic enamel. Here is my spray setup in my backyard. This just goes to show you don't need anything special. I've got the rims hung with fishing line between a hockey net and a clothes rack, and I've got the triple clamps hanging from that clothes rack with some wire. I followed the instructions provided on the can by doing 3 thin coats of the self-etching primer on the rims and triple clamps, each coat separated by 2 minutes. The wheel paint called for 3 light coats followed by 1 medium coat, each coat 10 minutes apart, and the acrylic enamel called for 2 light coats followed by 1 medium coat, again each 10 minutes apart. When painting parts in the past, I've had a tendency to be a little impatient with the initial coats, thinking I need to get full coverage, and as a result of that, I've had some problems with paint running, and although I'm still not perfect with my technique, I'm getting better, and these parts turned out quite well. Following my final color coats for both the rims and triple clamps, I switched to a clear coat. The clear coat for the wheels called for 2 to 3 light coats 10 minutes apart, and the clear coat enamel called for 2 light coats followed by a medium coat 10 minutes apart. With all of the application steps complete, I switched gears back to the hubs to install some new wheel bearings, and this would make sure that I was ready to lace the wheels as soon as the rims were fully cured. I keep the wheel bearings in the freezer, and then I torch the hub, and that makes for very easy wheel bearing installation. This Tusk bearing driver is a very nice tool to have, but for wheel bearings specifically, I ended up going back to a socket because the taper of that driver didn't work to get the bearings all the way inside the hub. After greasing up and installing the hub seals, I switched my attention to the forks, which were in desperate need of a rebuild and obviously would be installed shortly after those freshly painted triple clamps, so I wanted to be sure that these were ready to go, again, once those paints had fully cured. I cleaned up the forks before disassembly to make sure I didn't contaminate any internal components with dirt. I did this simply with dish soap and a sponge, and the forks cleaned up nicely, despite some nasty pitting on the outer tubes. I'd be lying if I told you this fork rebuild went completely smoothly. There was a point when the fork slipped out of the vise, dropped on the ground, and tipped my entire bucket of fork oil all over my shop, so that was an exciting cleanup. But you guys get to see the highlights of it, part of which, of course, is using a brand new dust seal and fork seal from Pro X on these forks to make sure that we take care of that leak. Despite my oil spill mishap, I was very happy to have checked the fork rebuild off the list and have one less item to do for this bike. After adding some brand new fork oil to these forks and getting them all buttoned back up, the rims were fully cured and it was time to lace them up with some brand new spokes. I apply anti-seize lubricant to every spoke, which is an important and often overlooked step when lacing wheels, and then I laced both wheels up without an issue. Everything went very smoothly and it didn't take me too much time to true them. I've gotten a whole lot better at this. On the YZ300 build, I actually made a full tutorial about how I lace and true wheels, so if you'd like to check that out, that will be linked on screen and in the description. With that front and rear wheel all laced up, I busted out the handy Rabiconda tire changer along with a fresh set of tires from Shinko Tires. I went with the 546 series, both front and rear. I have ran countless of these tires on my own bikes, and I think they hook up phenomenally. Tire installation went smoothly. I am a little bit more careful with the way I use tire irons after painting rims. While that paint is quite durable, it is possible to chip and damage it with a metal tire iron and lots of force. Thus, I just take an extra second of attention to make sure that my iron is properly hooked around the rim and doesn't slip when doing this on painted rims. For the rotors and sprocket, I used some shiny new hardware from Fastmetric, and then I went to install the new steering bearings. While I typically do this with a hammer and a punch because I simply haven't spent the money to buy the appropriate tool, I actually found that an extension from my shop vac did the job exceptionally well. I wasn't sure if it would just break because it was plastic, but I was able to get that stem bearing fully seated using that. After loading the bearings up with some fresh grease, I hit the nasty parts of the frame with soap and water. I know so many people are going to be asking why I'm not stripping and recoating this frame. I'm referring to this KX250 project as a revival. revival. And what separates a revival from an all-out build is those fine details. I bought this bike for $1,000 thinking I want to get it running, give it a new life, and make sure that somebody is riding it this summer. If I were to commit to doing an all-out build on this bike wouldn't be ready until wintertime in Montana, meaning it wouldn't be ridden until 2024. So I've kind of been picking and choosing where to spend my time and attention on this bike, and the ultimate goal is to make sure that it's reliable, runs well, and is ready to go. That said, it doesn't hurt to modernize it and make it prettier in the process, and I think these rims and triple clamps have done a great job at that already. Now let's slow things down a little bit and get to work on this engine. That's full body weight. Oh. And crack the clutch hub. Somebody hit this thing with the air impact when they put it on. I'm thinking about going to Harbor Freight and getting a serious air impact. I had planned to go air impact, but this was on sale for 60 bucks. I think 1,000 foot-pounds should do it. There it goes. Once I finally got that clutch hub nut removed, the rest of the engine disassembly went very smoothly. Again, my entire reason for splitting these cases was to clean out the nasty coolant mixture that had made its way into the crankcase from what I believe is a warped cylinder, but this gave me the opportunity to inspect those bearings, inspect the seals, and make sure that everything was good to go, including the transmission. I was pleased to find that the transmission looks perfect, and once I cleaned that nasty mixture out of the bearings and off of the crankshaft and added some two-stroke oil to those bearings, they were spinning smoothly with no cause for concern. So I cleaned up the mating surfaces of the case halves and applied some new Moto Seal before bolting the cases back together with some fresh fasteners from Fastmetric. I'm using Fastmetric fasteners throughout this project. Their engine bolt kits are awesome because they come in separate bags for every separate part of the engine, so they're super easy to use. They offer the same type of kits for the plastics and then jumbo bolt kits that can just be nice to have for the bike for things like the swing arm bolts, rotor and sprocket bolts, etc. After replacing oil seals as well as the water pump seals, it was time to button the bottom end back up. Now, with the bottom end all bolted back together, it's time to address the elephant in the room. What exactly caused the coolant to leak into the crankcase in the first place? Time to take a look at this cylinder. Upon inspection of the top surface of that cylinder, it became obvious that there was some weird grooving and imperfections, but nothing seemed too aggressive and it seemed fixable. So I removed all the power valve components and removed those studs to be able to get a closer look. I was surprised to find that the power valve components are relatively clean. They had much less carbon buildup than I would have expected. Now to get started with this cylinder, I used a fine cleaning wheel from Prime MX on my Dremel to smooth out a lot of that surface and see exactly what I was working with. And from there, I had it smoothed out pretty well, but you could still see some imperfections and grooving on that cylinder. At this point, I took the opportunity to reach out to a couple people more knowledgeable than myself to see what they would do, and Luke at Fathead Racing, as well as my dad, both had the same suggestion of using a piece of glass and some sandpaper to resurface this cylinder myself. This is something I have never done before, but the process was actually relatively simple. I bought some cheap glass at Ace Hardware and some sandpaper, created myself a block, and bolted it to my bench. I wet sanded using soap and water and continually checked the surface to see how my progress was, and luckily I bought 2 pieces of glass. I didn't realize how thin this was before I showed up to the store and figured it might break. I did end up breaking 1 piece of glass, but I set up the second one in the same manner, and I ended up getting this cylinder to look perfect on the surface. At this point, I finally had enough confidence in the cylinder to put it all back together, so I reinstalled those cylinder studs using the double nut method. Finally, the time had come to install this beautiful new piston from Pro X that's been sitting in a cabinet for far too long. After installing a new Pro X base gasket as well and then getting those piston clips installed, the cylinder was ready to go on. We got the cylinder bolted on, made sure that piston moved up and down smoothly, and then torqued down that head, and the engine was ready to go. I loaded this 20-year-old powerhouse up with some fresh oil, and it was time to drop it back in the frame. The next step was to move forward with this beat up swing arm and linkage and get those bearings replaced. I knew this would be no easy task because every single bolt on this bike has been completely and utterly seized. One of the linkage bolts was no exception to this, and despite the bolt only being $18 to replace, I really wanted to try and get this thing unseized on my own. The collar from the linkage bearing was seized heavily onto the bolt. This one took me about 2 hours and a lot of creativity. I decided to try and cut a notch in it with the angle grinder just to free it up a little bit, and then I continued to hit it with the map gas torch before finally making some progress. You can see I'm using every bit of my strength on the vise here, and the thing finally started moving. And with the limited throw of my vise, I had to continue getting creative with what could accept the bolt, and ended up using the actual linkage in order to finally get that thing pressed through. Truthfully, I impressed myself with how little I scratched the bolt with the angle grinder. It was time for Prime MX wheels, and I moved on to getting these swing arm bearings removed. By the looks of it, just like every other bearing on this bike, these things are 21 years old and have never been serviced. Absolutely destroyed, disgusting bearings. I ended up buying the Motion Pro bearing installer tool, which I've never used, and I was using it for removal as well. I did have to get a little bit creative with a socket, but it ended up working fairly well. It's a little bit easier than the vise method when you're working alone because you don't have to balance all the sockets in your hands. But I finally got every single linkage and swing arm bearing removed, and look at how nasty these things are. So they went straight in the garbage, and then I started preparing the linkage and swing arm for new bearings. I utilized Prime MX wheels to clean up those inner surfaces to make sure that bearing installation would go smoothly, and then I cleaned up all of the nasty dirt and grime from the components using Scotch-Brite and soap and water. Once I had all of the swing arm and linkage components cleaned up, it was time to install new bearings, so of course I did this with that Motion Pro tool. For the swing arm, it did work quite well and saved me some time over the vise method. For the linkage, I kind of used a combination of the tool and the vise method because the drivers don't fit the linkage perfectly. It is intended to be a swing arm bearing installation tool, but of course it'd be nice if it was a little bit more multi-purpose. I had no trouble at all cleaning all of the grime off these swing arm and linkage bolts and axles using Prime MX cleaning wheels, and then I began reinstalling the linkage and swing arm on the bike. If you're new to the channel, Prime MX cleaning wheels are an essential tool in any bike builder shop. These products seriously make refinishing any old parts so much easier and result in a better outcome than anything else on the market. So if you are interested in picking some up for yourself, I do earn a small commission if you use my link. I will have that on screen and in the description. After getting the linkage, swing arm, and engine torqued down to spec to make sure that nothing rattles loose with this epic KX250 power, it was time to move on to the electronics. Once I wrapped that up, I started installing coolant lines and then moved my way on to installing the clutch cable and clutch lever. I utilized a brand new clutch cable from Pro X because the old one was fraying pretty badly, so I knew the bike could benefit from that. And after reinstalling the handlebars, I put the clutch perch on the bars. I was a little bit on the fence on if I was going to replace this lever or not because it is a little bit beat up, but it's actually a really nice ASV clutch lever and perch with really good ergonomics that I believe are a little bit better than stock. So after deciding to go ahead and run that clutch lever, I installed some fresh grips along with that throttle tube, and the next obvious step was to move on to the carburetor. For the carb, I started by getting the majority of dirt and grime off using a toothbrush, soap, and water in the sink, just to make sure that I didn't get any small dirt particles in there once I started taking it apart. And after flushing it out with some carb cleaner, I checked the jets and I ended up going from a 55 to a 52 pilot based on my elevation, but that 55 was also fully clogged. So that may have had something to do with the bike not running before, along with the obvious engine problems that I believe we took care of. The next step was a big moment of truth with radiator installation and adding coolant to the machine because coolant was an issue before with leaking into the cylinder and crankcase. I scrubbed the majority of the 20-year-old grime off of the air boot and air box using Scotch-Brite and Simple Green. It's funny looking back at the day I bought this bike thinking, man, it's actually pretty clean, and then coming to find all of these nasty seized bolts and total neglect. But of course, one of the cleanest parts of this bike is that nice full FMF exhaust system. So that went on with no problem. It's always nice when a two-stroke header doesn't have any bend or damage that prevent it from aligning correctly. With the exhaust system installed, the bike then got a brand new air filter from Pro X. I coated that with some no-toil filter oil and installed it in the airbox. From here, it was just a matter of cleaning up and reinstalling a few final components before we moved our way on to the graphics and plastics. It would appear it's time for some fresh plastics, and I'm stoked to have partnered with MX Plastics and Decal Works on this project yet again. They're absolutely awesome because you can do mix and match plastic kits with different colors. Awesome custom graphics that I run on all of my bikes. Again, big thank you to MX Plastics, and if you guys are in need of plastics or decals for your bike, go through MX Plastics and Decal Works. Let's do it. I'm stoked. You guys are really gonna like these colors. I think, I like them a lot. guys, I promised that at the end of this start to finish video, I'd show you the next project. Come with me and let's take a look at the CR250.